The last thing I want to talk about is Jung's view of the human being and of the psyche and all that, and how that relates to Christianity. So, where am I? I lost my spot here. Yeah, so on 76, page 76, there's an interesting quotation where Jung talks more directly about religion, and I think it almost exposes him as an atheist, or at least a naturalist. He thinks that religious things are explained by human biology, right? That's his whole thing, right? Is that things that are highly symbolic come from the unconscious, and the unconscious is the reason it's universal is because it's rooted in our biology. Like that quote I read at the beginning. And so religion, well, it's highly symbolic, which means it must root from our biology, right? In that sense, it's not true, right? It's true only in the sense that we experience it, but it's not true in the sense that it exists in its own way outside of us, right? So like a conventional Christian wouldn't necessarily believe with Jung's take, at least on religion. So where are we? We're on page 76, I said, here. Where should I start reading from? I'll read this paragraph. So Jung writes, modern man may assert that he can dispose with them being religious symbols and convictions. Dispose with them, and he may bolster his opinion by insisting that there is no scientific evidence of their truth, or he may regret the loss of his convictions. But since we are dealing with invisible and unknowable things, for God is beyond human understanding, and there is no means of providing immortality, why should we bother about evidence? Even if we did not know by reason our need for salt in our food, we would still nonetheless profit from its use. We might argue that the use of salt is a mere illusion or taste or superstition, but it would still contribute to our well-being. Why then should we deprive ourselves of views that would prove helpful and in crises and give us meaning to our existence? And how do we know that such ideas are not true? Many people would agree with me that if I stated flatly that such ideas are probably illusions. I don't think most people would probably agree with you, but okay. What they fail to realize is that the denial is as impossible to prove as the assertion of religious belief. We are entirely free to choose which point of view to take. It will in any case be an arbitrary decision. I don't think it's an arbitrary decision, personally, and I don't think I would agree that most people would agree that such ideas are probably illusions, as he states. So I don't know where he got that from. Anyways, it makes it seem here that he's not really a Christian, right? He just kind of thinks that beliefs are useful, but not necessarily true. So kind of cringe, but hey, he's a smart guy, so we'll let it slide on that one. But we're not going to agree with him on that, but we'll let it slide. Also, another thing I disagree with is his conception of dreams. So I think there are multiple kinds of dreams, and I think that many dreams are like the type he describes, right? The dreams are the unconscious serving up unconscious material in the form of symbols and archetypes. Totally on board with that. But I don't think that that's the only function of dreams, right? I think dreams can also be divine or come from God, right? And so the scripture that I'm ripping out of context here, not necessarily out of context, that's tongue-in-cheek, of course, but taking from Job 33:15-18, it says, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people as they slumber in their beds, he may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to keep them from wrongdoing and keep them from pride, to preserve them from the pit, their lives from perishing by the sword. So in Job here, it's saying basically that, well, God could send us dreams to kind of prevent us from falling into worldly traps that would not only give us worldly consequences, but also keep us from going to hell. So I mean, it's scripture. I would tend to agree with it. So I think that maybe Jung is mistaking the part for the whole, and he's saying that dreams are always like this, but I don't think that's necessarily true. That's more of a small quibble, I guess. Another thing that I would point out in terms of Christianity and Jungianism is that Jung puts this big emphasis on individuation as kind of like the core human experience. That's like the telos, the point of life is to integrate the personality, the psyche, and come to terms with the self. Now, this scheme is particularly absent from the Bible, right? One thing the Bible is kind of clear on is what Protestants would call sanctification, right? Of course, glorification and justification are also necessary for salvation, but I'm focusing here on like our earthly experience. Sanctification is probably the closest thing that we can think of to individuation in the Christian scheme. So I was thinking how those two things relate to each other, and I found two key differences. Individuation is very focused only on the self, right? How do I experience these symbols? What do they mean for me? What are the fixations that I have to work through, etc., etc. Whereas in Christianity, sanctification is often thought of in terms of virtue, and that's often in terms of service, right? Like, how can I further the kingdom? How can I love God and love others? It's kind of, the focus is on others, not always just the self. So that's one of the key differences, is others versus self. The second thing is the process by which the person is individuated is through symbols, right? Through dreams. Whereas in Christianity, the way you become sanctified is by, dwelling in the Word, praying, you're developing virtue and avoiding sin, right? So those things are kind of totally separate, because the symbols come from the unconscious, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's from within you, right? Whereas virtue is something that is an objective standard that exists outside of ourselves. So I guess in both of these differences, the thing is that we're not following our own inner feelings or thoughts. We're focusing on God, others, and Scripture, which are outside of ourselves. They're more kind of objective or standard, I suppose. Another difference is that Jung sees the human nature as evolving. So I talked at the beginning about primitives and how they have the bush soul and how they kind of progress over time. And civilized man has this rift between their unconscious and their consciousness, and that they're going to evolve again to sort of reintegrate those two pieces. Whereas in the Bible, human nature is sort of more portrayed as sort of unchanging, right? Like, we have this original sin, and throughout all generations, humans are just learning to fight against that sin and become virtuous, right? So that's another thing, is this idea of evolution of the human psyche. I think that's a little bit different from the Christian scheme. And then lastly here, I've also got a few things. I talked about the two key differences between sanctification and individuation being like focus on the self versus focus on the other. On page 165 here, I want to read you a little excerpt, and it has to do with that same idea or division. It says, in order to bring the individuation process into reality, one must surrender consciously to the power of the unconscious, instead of thinking in terms of what one should do, or what is generally thought right, or of what usually happens. One must simply listen in order to learn what the inner totality, the self, wants to do here and now in a particular situation. So he's basically saying that in order to become individuated, you have to submit to the unconscious and listen to the self. Right? That's very contrary to what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know it? Right? So this key distinction between the self and the Word, or the Logos, God, that distinction is important.